Kate Mila Falcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book. We are on video number 5 of Sympathy Vote by Glenn Wall about the tragedy of the murder of Valerie Percy, daughter of eventual Senator Charles Percy, sister-in-law, eventually, of J. Rockefeller, from those Rockefellers, and just a really remarkable young woman who was murdered in her own bed. And the crime has never been solved. Maybe. So we're going to pursue the end of the book. I don't quite know if this will be a really long video or not that long. And I do have something else planned for an additional video that I'm hoping that you will also watch. Okay, let's move on with the book. If this is your first encounter here, we do this every weekend, different book, and we just cover it until it's covered. I try not to bombard you. I used to bombard you and people were like, oh, I can't keep up. So we're on chapter 22. The other 4 videos are from the last 2 weekends, and I was going to make a playlist and I forgot, but I will make a playlist. In fact, I'm going to write myself a message right now, and then I will have no excuse. Okay, let's start today with chapter 22, entitled The 1980s. So now this death was in the 60s, and we're moving forward in time. Hoff, the next door neighbor doctor, retired because of Parkinson's, and he remained in the same house. In 82, Percy's former opponent for governor in 64 was sentenced for filing false tax returns. He died in 1986, 4 years later, and was only 59. He died while washing his car. I think the moral of that story is don't wash your car. So, January 84, Linda Jadison, I hope, 43, was convicted of drug charges. Witnesses claimed that she had told a narcotics informant that she drove one of the 2 getaway cars for her brother-in-law, Billy Jackson. Oh, perhaps her last name was Jackson, and I can't read my handwriting. After the burglary at the Percy. So she's implicating her brother-in-law and his gang, and she was one of the getaway drivers. Allegedly, this is what she said. Is this true? We don't know. A lot of people who implied they knew what happened or claimed peripheral involvement were trying to get their particular sentences cut short or the charges lowered or whatever. There was always an ulterior motive. She denied ever saying this. She claimed that the drug charges were to pressure her to give information that the Billy Jackson gang had an alleged role in the murder. So the police were claiming she wanted to confess, and she was saying, I never did. They wanted me so that they could tie this case up with a bow, basically. The drug informant, Peter Kepsian, gave testimony that Linda told him in late 1981 that she knew who the murderer was, and she said, that's one burglary I feel really badly about. This begs the question, if this is true, why did they not kill anyone else in their many burglaries, or did they? We need to know more. There should have been some pursuit of this topic. Why would somebody be carrying a military knife, actually a bayonet, to a robbery for jewelry? And why would they wake Lorraine and Valerie after so many successful and quiet break-ins? Or did the killer break in specifically for the deed that was done? Jackson's attorneys claimed that Kepsian was the informant, had misled the police about her to get his charges reduced, and he did. He got probation. In 1985, Lamb, now if I'm remembering correctly, because, the Chicago detective, one of them, became chief of police of Barrington, Illinois, and he was the lead Percy investigator for 17 years. If you remember, they sought outside help because it was a small town. Kenilworth Police Department had no experience, and they were smart enough to ask for help. In 84, Percy was defeated for the first time in his fourth Senate run. He got 49.9% of the vote, and for the first time, Burghardt wasn't at his side. And they're kind of trying to imply that had he taken Burghardt on to run the campaign, things might have gone differently. He wrote to Percy and he offered to work on the campaign, and he never got a response, and then Percy lost for the first time. Percy later told him when they encountered each other, he told Burghardt, I didn't know about your letter. I didn't know you offered. So somebody was playing gatekeeper and made a fatal error there. But really, Percy lost because Illinois was going Democratic at the time. Roger, his son, thought that his father lost because he joined the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and opened himself up to attacks that they strayed from local and domestic issues, and his involvement in it took him too far away from state and local issues. Also, Reagan was more conservative, and with him he brought all these other very, very conservative Republicans in. In 84, Reagan was reelected. He said that Percy was a liberal on social issues and a conservative on financial issues, and it didn't gel with Reagan. He was really out of touch with what was becoming the new Republican Party. The same night that Percy lost, J. Rockefeller won the Senate in West Virginia, married to the victim's twin sister. July of 85, 18 years after Valerie died, Gary Wolf, who was the first cop on the scene, if you remember, stopped the motorcycle guy, he became the chief of police. Roddy retired after 27 years. Sharon, Valerie's sister, she was named the CEO of PBS in Arlington, which serves the DC area. In 89, Mr. Thornton, the father, died at 83 years of age. When he died, he was worth $70 million in $89. He was survived by his wife and his grandson, Michael, and he had founded the Great Western Steel Company. It's where he got all the millions of dollars. And in his obituary, there was no mention of either of his sons. 2 years later, in 1990, his wife died in Palm Beach. And it mentioned her philanthropy and her gardening and her grandson, and no mention of her sons. This is very sad, I think. It's very sad. Chapter 23. 24 years after losing in 1984, Percy, I'm sorry, I missed a comma. 24 years later, in 1984, Percy lost his fourth try, and he became a lobbyist. In 86, he honored the 20-year anniversary of Valerie's death. Later, he wrote a letter to somebody, and this is part of the letter. So he finally had the strength 20 years later to put home movies together with Valerie and the other children. And they showed them on the evening of September 18th, 1986. They brought back happy memories. He says to the letter receiver will never be satisfied, you said, until Valerie's death is cleared up once and for all. But I don't recall ever saying this, Percy says. Perhaps it was at the time that we felt by doing so we would have been able to prevent the possible death of somebody else. But after all these years, the despicable killer has received his just punishment in one way or another for the mortal sin which was committed years ago. It's not likely, however, that the criminal is still alive, and I doubt very much that what might be learned will contribute to the safety of somebody else. Therefore, it is our family's conclusion that the writing of this book would not accomplish any known valuable objective, and he was actually talking to a journalist who was interested in writing a book. So he didn't encourage him. He saw no point. Percy didn't mention the killer might still be alive and that his family could get justice. I don't know if those things didn't occur to him or he just neglected to mention them. He did authorize that the journalist who wanted to write the book, his name is Farber, Myron Farber, that he would have access to the reports and all the files and documents. He did help him in that way. 19 law enforcement agencies were eventually involved in this investigation. Farber said that he'd solve it, he told Percy, and Percy bought Farber's manuscript before it was published for a lot of money, and he was not impressed with it. Detective Lamb, retired now, told the Tribune, "I'm convinced that Malchow did it," this was that gang of thieves, "and acted alone. He was the prime subject for a variety of reasons for this detective. He specialized in nighttime home invasion burglaries. He was in the Chicago area at the time. He had at least 2 associates who said he claimed he did it. But Joe DiLeonardo from the Chicago police was retired. He became the chief investigator for the Cook County Sheriffs. So, you know, when they retire, that doesn't mean they take it easy. For many of them, they join these police departments really young, and they put in their 20 years to get a pension, and then they retire and do something else. In 94, he became a U.S. Marshal. In 93, as we mentioned, Hoff died after 10 years of Parkinson's, and his wife kept his letters back and forth from Percy. In 94, there was an article that described the Percy family, still private, and their home still very much off limits. Their present home, not the home where she died, that was demolished, but their present home, and I think they were still living in Washington, D.C. I could be wrong about that. But nevertheless, their residence was very much off limits because of the murder. They were very security conscious. In 95, Percy's 102-year-old mother died. In 96 was the 30th anniversary of Valerie's death. In 99, DiLeonardo retired, and in 2000, Bill Sumner, who was the lone detective for the Kenilworth Police Department, died. In 2002, the Kenilworth Police Department was assigned to reinvestigate, not the state police, but the Kenilworth Police. They had a good lead. They knew they now had resources. The resources, for example, of the North Regional Major Crimes Task Force that worked for 13 different suburbs of Chicago. Forensics had improved. Since 2004, David Miller was in charge, and everything was retested. DNA, looking for fingerprints, everything. In 2003, Valerie's stepmother, that's wrong. I wrote this wrong. 2003, Louise died. Louise is Louise Thornton, the wife of the one of the suspects. In 2006, the friend of the Percys who bought the house to save them the pain because they couldn't sell the house, the guy with the last name Graham, he died at the age of 94. In September 18th, 2006, Sharon, her sister, Jay Rockefeller, Sharon's husband, Roger, the brother, and his wife, they went to Valerie's grave for the 40th anniversary, and this was the last trip that they made there. Miller, the new assigned investigator, did local Chicago public TV shows and said if there was evidence, the suspects would have been charged. They're not holding back on anything. In 2008, Valerie's ashes were moved to Washington, D.C. And Percy had Alzheimer's. He was 89. Burghardt visited and saw how ill Charles Percy was and how well Lorraine was coping with it. In April of 2009, 75-year-old William Jackson, a former gang member, and his nephew Kenneth, who was 50, were arrested for residential burglary and felony possession of stolen property. Still going strong, 75 years old. He was suspected of 19 burglaries along the North Shore, including around Kenilworth. He was living in a fancy house in a prosperous village and commented, "Who says burglary doesn't pay?" He was still committing home invasions in his 70s. He was charged with more charges in 2012. Places that he broke into while the residents were there sleeping, which is a particular kind of crime. It goes beyond wanting to steal something. There's a lot of weird psychological stuff there. Percy's 3 lots, the old farmhouse, the fancy house, and then the extra lot, sold for $9.7 million in 2010. The niece of the patrolman, Malcolm Caskey, who had retired, she bought it. She bought the house. After they bought it, they went up to Valerie's bedroom and just, kind of like visiting a shrine. It was just very sad. In 2011, Hoff's widow gave a writer a 2,000-word account of the murder that Hoff had written himself afterwards, like he got it down on paper so he wouldn't forget anything. And this became the subject of the Chicago Tribune story. In September of 2011, one day before the 45th anniversary of Valerie's death, 91-year-old Charles Percy died. In 2011, investigations into new leads happened, and it was all closed down in 2012. Jay Rockefeller retired from politics in 2014, which ended a dynasty that began with his great-grandfather Nelson Wilmardle Aldrich, who was a senator, and his uncle Winthrop, who was a senator, and Nelson Aldrich, who was a vice president. In 2014, McCaskey, her husband, and twin girls moved in to the house, and I put exclamation point, and it really wasn't the original house. I mean, it was the bones of the original house. Poor choice of words. But it was completely gutted and completely taken down to the boards. Chapter 24, The Detectives. D. Leonardi and Lamb agree that criminals work at all hours, no safe time, and most of us would have trouble proving our whereabouts at 5 o'clock in the morning. So even a criminal, a known criminal who can't prove where he or she is at 5 in the morning, yes, they do work then, but how easy is it for any of us? D. Leonardi didn't think that it was the Malcow gang. He thought it was really professional burglars. They were very lucky amateur criminals. But he thinks it was professional, like the kind that they make movies about. Nothing else was touched in this house. And he says if they were just your ordinary run-of-the-mill criminals, they would have sneaked in quietly, as they did in other places, taken stuff that was valuable from the first floor and creeped out, and nothing happened like that. He actually doesn't think that it was really for burglary at all. He said it was revenge, and he felt like the killer was familiar with the inside of the house. I guess I read that wrong, because that doesn't make sense. I think he didn't believe it was any kind of burglar, not just professional, but any kind. He just didn't think that it looked like any kind of a burglar. Nothing got stolen. And burglars don't go in upstairs to this really difficult to navigate house and single out a young woman to murder in her bed and then not steal anything. It doesn't make logical sense. Lamb thought that the Malchow gang did it, but the bayonet didn't fit his MO. Didn't fit the MO of a normal, typical home invader. And nor did making so much noise that people in the house woke up. That's not typical. Members of that particular gang were convicted SA offenders, and there is a school of thought, there is a subset of investigators who to this day believe that that was the motivation behind this crime, that she was targeted, and she was targeted for, I don't know how to put it without getting in trouble here. I think you know what I'm trying to imply. These sorts of homicides are rare. In 97, based on FBI statistics, there were 67 of those type in the U.S. out of over 15,000 murders. So someone who is that kind of killer is a very unusual sort of crime. So you need to look for any prior similar crimes at all, because there may be a link. And there was nothing like that associated with the Malchow gang. Taking it to the point of murder, that's what they're getting at. That even the beginning of that crime, okay, it doesn't make sense for a regular burglar that it would end up the way it did. Very extreme result. So if you can dismiss that it was a burglar, nothing was stolen, look at the crime that was committed. What was the motivation? I think you know what I'm implying. And they're saying, yes, there were people in that gang who were inclined to that sort of attack, but not to the extreme of murder. To take it to that extreme is a particular psychological problem, and you're likely to find it connected to other things. That wasn't the first rodeo. Daniel Malchow, Fred Malchow's brother, said to go into somebody's house and take that risk for whatever reason, violence is inherent if you're confronted. But she was in her bed, so he believed that his brother Fred would have been capable of doing that to somebody. Once he said when robbing a home with his brother, Fred had wanted to go in, and the homeowner's wife was alone in bed. But David, his brother, talked him out of it. He told him, look, all we're here for is the diamonds. He thinks they broke in to rob the house for jewelry, saw a pretty girl, and went for it. Lamb agrees that Thornton is probably the best suspect because of his location, because of his history, and because he was so into military weapons. That seems like the kind of the missing link in all of this. How unusual is that? They investigated him, but they believed he had an alibi, and yet he was never eliminated. So they must not have believed his alibi was rock solid. The only documentation that they have about him came from his parole officer in Los Angeles. Nobody seems to know what that was all about. It seems like there were suspicions brewing. Either they didn't follow up or they couldn't get enough information to follow up. This mystery just hangs there. I hate that. Chapter 45, The Case Against William Thornton. In 1966, it's really difficult to get information about communication and forensics. There's so much has changed. We're kind of spoiled by how much easier it is to find out about things. Investigators try to stay open-minded about possible perpetrators, but he looks very tempting, right? But they're trying very hard. And they say, you know, Valerie Percy had a limitless future. She had so much going for her. But so did Thornton. He was the son of a multimillionaire. His wife, on the record, said she believed that he killed multiple people. And in 2013, Miller didn't answer questions about potential DNA. He would not talk to investigative journalists about. He was holding evidence close to his chest. He said it's not appropriate. It's inappropriate to talk about this stuff because this case is still open. 2013. But no evidence has ever been definitively tied to any one suspect, and numerous suspects have been cleared. Malchow and Thornton both are dead. They were both dead by the mid-70s. Thornton was never named publicly as a suspect, and really until today was unknown outside of law enforcement even to those studying the case, because they kept this close to their chest. They didn't name him publicly. He really is the strongest subject, not the only one, but a very strong one. He's been known to law enforcement since 1951, but law enforcement did not know that how he was involved in the death of his brother. And no one knew until he died in the 1970s, and his wife told law enforcement that he had killed other people, that he had created this plot to kill his parents and the housekeeper. All of this stuff came out after the fact. The Kenilworth law enforcement did know that he was a suspect in the murder of Judith Anderson. It's not known how long Chicago really looked at him for that, how seriously they took it. Dr. Hoff immediately thought that the killer was deranged. I mean, the night of the murder, he had never seen anything like it. And at this time, in 1966, Thornton had been in and out of numerous facilities, mental facilities. And he was reckless and violent. I mean, if we did the psychopathy checklist, it would be all filled in. Indications that he did it. This is a little summary of why he would be a suspect. The weapon, the smoking bayonet. The Cook County coroner said that the weapon was a certain type of bayonet, had no rust, it was newly in the water. It was found in the lake near the Percy's house 3 days after the murder. Joe DeLeonardi, with extensive experience, said he had never, in all of his years, never seen a civilian killed with a bayonet. And Lamb agreed. The two experienced Chicago investigators said this is really odd. 6 months after the Percy slaying, Thornton was found with military weapons, 70 tons of them, and including numerous bayonets. Letters prove that Thornton admitted that he had war weapons in the family home since 1950s. So next there's proximity, their location, now proximity. Thornton was raised near the Percys, and he visited their family home often. His brother, in 1964, wrote from Amsterdam, "Why are you always returning and causing trouble and deserting your wife?" So he was always back and forth, and this is evidence. This is not suspected. This is evidence. By September of 65, his parents and his brother and he had extremely strained relationships. But Louise revealed that after his brother's death, William's father again became a part of his life. She thought the father was concerned about Thornton and, keep your enemies close. Because of the grandchild, the parents let him back home. They were worried about this little baby. The home was a convenient staging area for home invasions in the neighborhood. The Puricellos, the Percys, and there were more. A Northwest University student, this we've talked about this, saw a man at the end of the Percy driveway staring at the house 4 hours before the murder. Was that William Thornton? It's an easy walk from his parents' house. Then there's motive. Why would he risk breaking in with people at home just to kill somebody, just to kill her? The report Louise said that he did these crimes for the thrill and the challenge, and it is a particular feature of many psychopaths that they are without emotion. They do not feel. It's like they're numb, and they feel something. Sometimes by taking risks, they'll jump out of airplanes with parachutes. They'll ski from the top of the Alps. They'll deep sea dive with sharks. You know, they do things that are stimulating adrenaline. And when they're sick enough, because they're not all, you know, in fact, they're very rarely any kind of killer. But when they are, they'll often do it just for the thrill of it because it makes them feel something. His friends in San Francisco were terrified by his reckless driving. They didn't want to get in the car with him. As a child, law enforcement caught him risk-taking multiple times, just so many different instances of things that he did that were just beyond the pale. She called him, I'm afraid to use this word, it starts with an S, and we're going to make that an adverb. Nihilistic, that kind of nihilism, like no regard for one's own well-being and survival. And when he had his brother killed, and he was at that point, she said, and then later, just, you know, FYI, she ended up shooting him and killing him because he went after her. And she said it was just... So then they looked at the actual crime itself, and they said that the bludgeoning were the fatal wounds. And he had confessed to Louise that he had bludgeoned Stoddard to kill him, and that he had to do the same thing. Or did he do the same thing to Valerie? The method of entry into the house. The perpetrator at the Puricello house who broke in used the same entry, the same, how do I explain, not the same, different houses, the same method of entry. At the Puricellos, it was on the second floor, off a balcony, through French doors into a dressing room. At the Percys, it was from a back patio through French doors into like a living room with a piano. Both of them woke people up accidentally. And both crimes included the sound of breaking glass when they cut the window. Law enforcement said a seasoned home invader would have done this, and a professional thief like Malkow, because they will be very quiet. Thornton was not an accomplished home invader. He was reckless and a risk taker. And all of the three cases we just mentioned were unusual. They were not typical. They were very silent. The timeline. The three crimes that they looked at Thornton for were January 12th of 65, September 17th of 66, and September 18th of 66. And he is not accounted for anywhere. His whereabouts were unknown at the time. Now, the suspect description, that the suspect was around 175 pounds, dark eyes, brown hair, possibly about 6'1", 28 years old, youthful looking. Lorraine said he was shorter, but the suspect was across the room and bending over when she approximated his height. And it was dark. The link to Lake Forest, Louise said that Thornton admitted to conspiring to murder his brother. His brother was found in a rented car in Lake Forest near the Wacker home, which was invaded 8 months earlier. That's the third. There's the Piricello, Wackers, Percy's. Did the killer return to a familiar place? Then there's the killer's strength. Vernon Roddy, 50 years later, still remembered Thornson's strength. Valerie was hit more than 12 times and her skull was completely fractured. Joe De Leonardi, I can never say his name, De Leonardi, said that this had angry male written all over it, this crime. I always thought that. It always just sounded like personal. And personal doesn't necessarily mean with a long history. Personal means this victim is not cooperating and I'm taking it personally. The glove that was found near the house had blood on it, was wet. It had screen fibers from the house screen. And it wasn't the kind of glove a jewel thief would use or that home invaders would use. It was an unusual glove. They found a moccasin on the beach. I don't remember how much we mentioned that. They never completely connected it, but it was just one moccasin lying on the beach. It was very in style with young people at the time. The police chief said, oh, it's not significant, but people wondered, why would he say that? He would never discuss it. The reality is it was, well, we'll get to it. Miller says it's doubtful that it's significant, but it's really tantalizing because the police repeatedly refused to talk about it. They won't even discuss it. The style had become hot style in San Francisco that year, and Thornton was from San Francisco's Pacific Heights, where he lived with his wife, 2 miles from Haight-Ashbury. And I remember those kind of moccasins, very popular. Judith Mae Anderson, this is this other case that has a Thornton link. It's notable that in 1957, the Chicago cops traveled to Kenilworth to ask Thornton about Judith Anderson's death. Law enforcement had been called by more than one young woman to say that Thornton and a friend had discussed a murder similar to Anderson's, the planning or doing or whatever, and was more than one young woman was disturbed enough to call the police. Traces of powder made in from or used by steel manufacturing were found in the containers with Anderson's body. Thornton's dad owned the Great Western Steel Works, and Thornton worked there for him for a while. Anderson was shot with old ammo, as in Thornton's extensive ammunition collection. Anderson's body was found in steel barrels that were tossed into the harbor, and Stoddard's body was tossed into the ocean. So these are the reasons why they're thinking about these people or thinking maybe somebody else. The afterword. Law enforcement didn't know if Thornton was ever polygraphed. 41 people were. Both of the Percy parents were. Lorraine was polygraphed twice. Thornton was not investigated hard. He was just lumped together with a bunch of random suspects. In 2011, Sharon revealed that she'd hired a law firm to investigate and had a plausible theory, but would not disclose the ID of who they think it was. They did link it with Piricello's. They did. Jill Piricello saw footprints in the flower bed under the balcony where this intruder had entered. And nobody knows if those footprints were investigated. No vehicle was ever linked to either crime. So was it a local going on foot, like Thornton? same point, somebody could have parked a few blocks away and then just left quietly and gone to a car. Thornton and the FBI. This gets interesting. In 2014, it's not a page I have to read. Okay, in 2014, there was a 275-page case file that showed the FBI had investigated Thornton thoroughly. October 13th of 66, he had been arrested in Phoenix for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. But at the time, the local FBI did not know that he was wanted for questioning about the Percy murder. The FBI had looked at the San Francisco house. They had these two different FBI offices investigating the same guy for different things, and they didn't communicate. He had been remodeling this house that they had in San Francisco, but he would work on it at night. The neighbors were complaining all the time, and he had not been around for more than a month. So, astonishingly, okay, where did we go here? Thornton is a very strange person. This is part of a letter. Has a very bad speech impediment, stuttering, and all of his actions at the house have been mysterious. In the context of the Puricello home invasion and the Percy murder, which took place at approximately 5:20 or 5 a.m. respectively, depending on who you talk to, Thornton's nocturnal ways are intriguing, to say the least. Astonishingly, another FBI memo from San Francisco dated December 21st, 66 says, New York Division also note that arms and ammunition and items confiscated from his wife at JFK, 12/14/66, contained 4 bayonets, and suspected murder weapon of Valerie Percy was also a bayonet. So the FBI themselves made a link, and it's on paper in the file. Tucson, July of 66, he brutally assaulted an employee at the Highway House Hotel where he was staying. Hair trigger temper. Because the guy served him the wrong drink, he flew into a violent rage. He broke the guy's arm, and he had a permanent impairment because of it. He was arrested by the marshals, but he posted a $5,000 bond. This guy's rich, right? Louise is correct. His mental state was declining. He was getting more and more aggressive. He was stopped and then let go at New York City at the Kennedy Airport. In December of 66, the Chicago FBI told the New York FBI about the trouble locating him, and they just kept missing him as he moved about. Peripatetic. I mean, it's very common that serial killers, psychopaths do that. They restless, itchy feet, always moving. Finally, he was gotten at the New York Hilton on the phone, and he said he could be of no help. They finally got to talk to him. Be of no help on the Percy case. He refused to answer questions. He refused to give interviews. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army discovered that the ammunition that he had in his big collection was from 1944. There were concerns, but no evidence, and he was associated with the Minutemen far-right anti-communist group who were hoarding weapons. So this was maybe why he had all these weapons. I wondered about that, like, what is this guy doing? Arms dealing? What's going on here? The FBI requested photos of the seized weapons to compare the bayonets with the Percy weapon. They couldn't figure out where Thornton got the weapons. They didn't realize that he'd hoarded them. They were very old, from 42 and 40 to 44, and they didn't realize that this guy had all these old weapons. The bayonet in the Percy case came from that time period. The Army told the FBI that they could be bought by civilians in stores. You just go into an Army-Navy surplus store. By 1968, Thornton had many legal problems, enough to hire people to represent him, and enough money to stay on the move. He took lots of planes. He was always flying out. He was unpredictable. He didn't have a job schedule. He didn't have anywhere he was beholden to be. Although sometimes he had to be in court. By the late 60s, he started traveling by train because he He even considered buying his own train car because he thought it would be harder to track him down. Lamb, in 2014, finally got to see the FBI file. During the active investigation in the 60s and 70s, the law enforcement investigation did not know that the FBI was pursuing this lead on Thornton and bayonets. So the law enforcement, the investigators investigating the murder, didn't know that the FBI was investigating his access to bayonets in relationship to the murder. There was just no communication. And that is how the story ends. And of course, not to sound cavalier, this is far more than just a mystery or a story. This is a terrible tragedy, a very sad thing that happened. An example, I think, in many ways, of how money came into play for both the victims and the suspects, and yet investigation was so hampered by a lack of the technology that we take for granted now. Really interesting. We're going to pursue this a little more with Deborah, coming up eventually. Not at the moment, but soon. And I'm open to suggestions. I know this is sort of a conflation of our Saturday book and an unsolved case, but it's a situation that I've always been intrigued by, and I was excited to find a good book about it. So, you know, combine my interests. So thank you very much for watching. Now, I am going to make another video, and this other video is going to be about a topic that I'm going to be following, and with the help of other people. Nate will be helping, another friend of mine will be helping, and they know more about this topic than I do. They're the ones who got me interested, and I think everybody who watches my channel will find it really interesting. So I'm making a little introductory video. I'll be putting it up after this particular video is over, since we only have one video for our book today. And I don't have a schedule yet of when we're going to do the next video related to our new topic. We will have a new book coming up next week. And in the meantime, Slumber Foil, Sláinte.